Hey guys, so we are going to talk about imperialism. Several of you, first period, you guys have already gone through all this stuff, so go ahead and just skip forward to the slide that we left off on. We briefly did the white man's burden and kind of talked about the questions, and you guys are supposed to answer the questions on the back. If you haven't done that yet, go ahead and finish that up. For third period, go ahead and do this, and then do the white man's burden questions. All right, so we're getting into American imperialism, which is this age in which we're spreading overseas, right? We've kind of finished with Manifest Destiny. We've spread across the continent. We've realized America's God-given right to expand. And so the next question is going to be, should we or should we not spread overseas, right? Should we or should we not continue to expand? Now, before we get into this, it's really important to understand the difference between imperialism and colonialism. Now, colonialism is a type of imperialism, but there is a distinction, and it's an important one when it comes to American history. So for imperialism, really what we're looking at here is imperialism is sort of a broad version of extending control over other nations or territories, either directly through war, acquisition of territory, occupation, or indirectly, using economic influence, cultural influence, political influence, something like that. Now, colonialism is a type of imperialism. However, it is a much more direct type, right? It's a nation physically taking over control of another nation, generally through military force, often through settlement, right? So the British Empire is an excellent example of this, right? The British go into India, they subjugate the Indian peoples, they take over, they rule, right? They exploit their economic resources, and they use all of the resources there to strengthen their own power and their own economy. So most European nations at the time, right, are colonial. Now, Americans don't want to be colonial, right? Why? Well, hopefully you can put that together. We were once ruled by Britain, right? So we have this big aversion to being colonists. We don't want to do that, right? And what's really important to understand here is how deeply, particularly in this time period, that Americans believed in our own American ideology, right? We deeply believed in the ideas, we still do, but in the ideals of freedom and democracy and self-determination and all these things. And so because so much of our identity is tied up in rejecting our colonial oppressors, right, and being the land of the free with opportunity and allowing each person to live freely and determine their own path and have their own self-determination, we can't reconcile that idealism with colonialism, right? We can't go overseas and conquer people. We can't do that because that would just be being like Britain. That would be a betrayal of everything that is American. And so we have these two sides of us, right? We've got this side that believes deeply in our ideology, but we also have the side that does want to go out and explore and does want to go out and take over places and wants to exploit resources and really wants to be a world power, right? So how do we reconcile those economic needs, right, those desires, with our idealism? The way that we're going to do that is basically by combining them, right? We say we're going overseas, we're expanding into other countries in order to bring them democracy, in order to bring them self-determination, right? We're bringing something wonderful to these other countries. We are bringing American ideology to people who don't necessarily have it, right? And this has taken many forms over the years, ranging from like bringing it to the Philippines, where we talked about people as like half devil, half child, right? Very much white man's burden stuff, to bringing democracy to horrific nations with horrific dictators, right? If you look at Iraq, right? Overthrowing Saddam Hussein, who was awful to his people. But still we're using that same type of justification, which makes us still be in line with American ideology rather than being in line with British ideology. Now, the next thing to just remember is sort of what's going on in Europe at this time. I think we have a tendency to kind of forget just exactly what they're doing too. So as we get into the turn of the century, right, the British Empire is the most powerful country in the world. This is where we get the sun never sets on the British Empire type of thing. Britain controls everything, everywhere, pretty much. Now, the other area that we've just done our major rush to carve up, right, is Africa. So we have all these European countries who've been going in and colonizing the African continent. This is where we get King Leopold, right, of Belgium. Now, when we think back just to numbers too, I think we often overlook just how horrific what he did to the Congo was, right? Hitler killed 6 million Jews in his concentration camps, and just Jews. That figure is much higher when you include everyone else who was part of the Holocaust too. King Leopold killed 10 million of the Congolese people. So this is this other incredible figure as he's exploiting the region, right? He's growing rubber plants and he's murdering all these people. So that's happening throughout Europe, and European culture is so tied into conquest at this point in time. And America wants to compete, but we can't quite do that. So that's part of why we're figuring out this other way. Now, if you look at the map too, there's a couple white spots on there that are not controlled by any European country at this point in time. Bandit, shush. I want to draw your attention both to Latin America, right, which was at one point controlled by Spain. However, most every Latin American country has overthrown their colonial, empire, the colonial conquerors, which is Spain, and instituted their own republic. So these are all independent nations. China also is independent at this point. Now they've been doing some dealings with Britain, right? We're getting into the Opium Wars, into the open door policy, right? They're starting to deal with Britain and only Britain, but they are still a sovereign nation. And then we have the Middle East there, which at the time was ruled by the Ottoman Empire. Right, they've been around for a really long time. They'll be there until 1922 with the fall, or with the end in the aftermath of World War I. So that's kind of what's going on with the world, just to give us a sense of who's where and what's going on. Now, despite this, not all Americans are on board with expansion, right? We have plenty who just want to be isolationists. They don't believe in expanding beyond our borders for many different reasons. And it's important to remember, too, right, just how varied these reasons are. It's not just one belief. It's many people who believe different reasons, but they're all able to come together to unite. First is the fear of overextension. Right, the idea that America is not quite strong enough yet to begin expanding overseas. They point to, empires like Rome, who expanded too fast, too quickly, too far, too quickly, and it ended up toppling the empire. And it was, well, we just made it across the continent. Let's build up our infrastructure. Let's do all of this before we begin even thinking about going overseas. Other people argued that it would simply cost too much. Right? Military is expensive. Expansion is expensive. And so the feeling was we didn't have the funds to cover this yet. We're still a growing nation, right? We weren't capable of doing this yet. Another fear was that jobs would go overseas, that all of a sudden a lot of the industry and stuff would be put in other countries and Americans would be losing their jobs. Some people just held very tightly to the idea that it violated the Declaration of Independence, right? It goes against American ideas to take over another country. It goes against the promise of life, liberty, and property to every man, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So there's a big pushback there. Some people are simply pacifists. They just don't believe in fighting. And then we have our nativists, right? And nativists are basically people who don't want lesser quality people immigrating, right? So they look at these countries and they're like, oh my God, there's brown people in those countries. That's so scary. Those countries, we don't want brown people in America. Why would we want people of inferior stock immigrating here? And if we take over those countries, they're going to immigrate here. So this is very much tied up in like social Darwinist ideology, right? And we'll keep going through that as we get into the 1920s too. The Anti-Imperialist League was sort of a combination of many different isolationists, and each person had their own reason for being part of this. But they will actively fight against the Spanish-American War and the acquisition of the Philippines. So the guy there, hopefully you all recognize, that's Mark Twain. And Mark Twain will be vice president of the Anti-Imperialist League until his death in 1910. He was a very active voice. Other prominent members include former President Benjamin Harrison, former President Grover Cleveland, Andrew Carnegie, right, our steel magnate, the second wealthiest man in the world, Samuel Gompers, who was a labor leader, right, so again, we're seeing this wide variety, and then Jane Addams, who had been part of the Hull House and had founded the Hull House and was part of settlement houses across the board. Now, we also have some pretty intense expansionists as well. Now, the expansionists base their desires off of multiple reasons. One is simple patriotism, right? Americans want to compete on the world stage. We want to be taken seriously by Europe. We want to be a world power, right? We want to make sure that the security of our country is there and that we are looked to as a powerful and important nation. Additionally, profit, right? We want to expand America's profit. That would secure jobs. And part of the way that we do this too is by opening up markets. Right? We need new places to sell our goods. And so going overseas and taking over other places, that means new people that can buy our stuff as well. It also means a variety of different new natural resources that we can use. Other people want to expand for religious reasons, right? They want to continue missionary work. They want to Christianize the rest of the world. But really what this sort of comes down to as a core is paternalism, right? This idea that, which is sort of the reconciliation of these two ideals of Americanism, but we want to expand because we want to bring democracy to everyone else, right? That's a way to justify all of this. We can bring civilization, we can bring self-determination and self-government to the people who don't have that, or the people who are unfit to do that currently. And finally, there's a political aspect too. Expansion and that patriotism aspect can bring an element of distraction from domestic turmoil, right? It can give people another focus where they're not focusing on what's happening at home. And so that's going to be, that'll be a good selling point for a lot of politicians. I also want to make it clear that we don't just jump one way or the other, right? This is a discussion we're consistently having all the way through World War II. We become isolationists, then expansionists, isolationists, expansionists, and it goes back and forth as each side sort of grows in popularity or wanes in popularity. All right, so what I want you guys to go ahead and do now is grab the White Man's Burden reading. It's a poem written by Rudyard Kipling. Right, Rudyard Kipling, too, is also the guy who wrote The Jungle Book, just in case anyone didn't know that. There should be a handout at the front of class on the little black tray thing next to my podium. So go ahead and grab one of those, read through it. Please answer the questions on the back. You're welcome to work together. I would encourage it and answer those questions on the actual worksheet. You can answer them here on your lecture, too, if you want to. So just briefly, in terms of the facts, the White Man's Burden, right, we look at this a lot in European history. It's written in 1899, and it plays on the supposed or presumed responsibility that white people have to govern and impart their culture onto non-white people, and particularly sort of Northern and Western Europeans versus the Southern Eastern Europeans, too. And the idea, too, is like, there's this element of the inherent superiority of Anglo-Saxon culture, but also a part of this, too, is going to be, it's a thankless job. That's what they say in the poem a lot, is no one's going to thank you, but because you are so superior, you just have to do it anyway. So go ahead and read through that. We'll touch on it a little bit when I get back, but this should feel familiar from your years of world history. So, how do we kind of make this, how do we go from isolationist to imperialist? Well, we have several things going on within the United States that makes this really necessary and possible. First, we're seeing an increase in population, an increase in wealth, and an increase in industrial production. All of these things mean we're making more goods, there's more wealth to be had, and as we see a population increase, more people want jobs. But that also is going to sort of increase our desire to possibly look overseas, right? To look for economic opportunity overseas, to look for new markets overseas, right? New peoples to buy our goods, therefore more profit to be made. And then we have this deep competition, like we talked about, with modern nation states. We want to be just as powerful as Europe, right? We want to play with the big boys. Now, there are several inciting factors, too, that are really going to aid in our initial push to expand overseas. One of the first is yellow journalism. Yellow journalism is like clickbait today, right? It is scandalous, it is sensational, it is unethical journalism in every sense of the word. It's tabloids, right? Now, the point is to print the craziest story possible so that people will buy your magazine, right? And a lot of this really develops, too, out of a circulation duel, out of these two sort of dueling newspapers. The first is William Randolph Hearst. He produces the New York Journal. And the second is Joseph Pulitzer, who produces The World. Now, Hearst, right, that's where we get Hearst Castle. You should take a second and look that up right now because that'll give you a sense of his wealth. It's insane. It's in California. You should all go, too. It's pretty crazy. But he writes the New York Journal, and so he's one of the major competitors. And then Joseph Pulitzer of the Pulitzer Prize writes The World. And each is attempting to outdo each other with invented and exaggerated atrocities and crazy things that they can come up with. They sensationalize stories in order to sell out newspapers. And this kind of journalism really incites and inspires a lot of anti-Spanish sentiment, which will ultimately result in war. Right? They're going to propagate stories of Spanish brutality. They're going to talk about the explosion of the USS Maine, right? All these things that will really get people to be terrified of the Spanish and what they're capable of, and make it necessary for us to go to war. On top of this, we also will have our ideas about social Darwinism and the superiority of Anglo-Saxon culture and civilization with this idea, like we've been talking about, that we are the strong and the fit, right? We are the ones who need to rule the world, and we need to bring what we have, our amazing culture and everything, to everyone else, and that will be used as our justification to go overseas. Now, we've seen a little bit of discussion so far about expansion overseas, so I do want to touch on this very quickly. Right, one of our first major doctrines or corollaries we're going to look at is the Monroe Doctrine. Right, that was passed by Monroe in 1823. And if we can remember back to this, we are warning Europe, basically, to stay out of the affairs of the Western Hemisphere, right? So that's that first cartoon right there. We're saying, hey, Europe was talking about intervening again in Latin America, and we're saying, hey, no, you can't do that. You can't be colonists over here. We will consider it an affront to us if you guys invade anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, so don't. Now, we've also seen the expansion of America in other ways, right? Even though we haven't been expanding overseas, we've been expanding through manifest destiny. And this is a very important distinction. So with manifest destiny, this is not the same as imperialism. We do not believe that we're bringing American civilization to the poor, downtrodden people and then we're going to leave, right? We believe we're expanding into a howling wilderness. And understanding that distinction is very important. We believe we're manifesting our destiny, right? We're completing American exceptionalism by expanding throughout the continent and taking over all of North America. Whereas with imperialism, it's going to be much more sort of intermittent, right? We're going to intervene and then leave and intervene and then leave because we're trying to help people institute democracy, right? We're not just taking over or colonizing or conquering an existing people. We're just helping. Right? That's the idea. And so, manifest destiny has been realized, right? We've been expanding across the continent, but we have been expanding. It's just under a very different type of justification and a very different type of ideology. And we can point to, right, we moved from, as soon as we became a country, right, we had up until the Mississippi River. We'll then gain the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. We'll then fight we'll start dealing with the Oregon Territory and Texas, and then we'll fight the Mexican-American War to get the Mexican cession. We also buy Alaska from Russia in 1867, so we've also acquired that territory, even though we don't bring it into a state until the mid-1900s. Story of when we bought Alaska, it ended up being known as something called Seward's Folly. So the Secretary of State at the time, named William Seward, bought Alaska for $7.2 million from Russia. And everyone was like, dude, why did you do that? That was the dumbest move ever. You just bought a godforsaken spit of ice in the middle of nowhere that's not even connected to the continent. And he's like, no, it was a great idea. And he ends up sort of going down with all this humiliation of he made this big mistake. Until we discover gold there in 1899. We will also discover oil there, and then Alaska becomes incredibly profitable. Now, the Roosevelt Corollary is going to be the new one. The Roosevelt Corollary is passed by Teddy Roosevelt in 1904. And it justifies American intervention to ensure, quote, stable, orderly, and prosperous neighbors. It promises that chronic wrongdoing would require the United States to intervene as an international police power. So it's saying, if we see other countries doing chronic wrongdoings, right, we can then intervene to protect them, right? We're a police force. We're not taking over. We're just temporarily helping like the police do and then backing off. But that gives us this huge open door of anywhere that we want to ensure stable, orderly, and prosperous neighbors, that's where we're going to intervene. And intervene we do, right? This is just a sample of United States interventions in Latin America. The real list is far longer. But you can see, too, and what I want you to pay attention to is a lot of the intermittent sort of actions of this, right? We go in for 6 years. We go in for 1 year. We go in for part of a year. We go in for 3 years. Like, if you look at this list, right? There's all of these little amounts of time that we go in. It's rare that we see these big, long stretches, really, until we get into the later 1900s. Now, Nicaragua will be a big one that we're involved in for a long time. We'll be involved in Cuba very intermittently, very frequently. We'll be involved in Honduras and Panama too, right? We helped build the Panama Canal. But all of these interventions, if you read through them and take a minute to look at them, right, we go in order oftentimes to protect American interests or to protect the stability of the region if we're worried that a dictator or someone's going to do something and overthrow. So we've been involved a lot. But again, if you kind of get the gist here, it's not like we're just moving in and occupying. And that distinction is so important because it makes us feel different from Britain. Now, the next and sort of last final piece of what will become the American states is Hawaii. So we've got Alaska already, right? That was Seward's Folly, and now we have Hawaii. So Hawaii had actually been, first sort of discovered, as you could say, by European explorers before the 19th century, right? That's where we have James Cook, and he got killed and all that fun stuff. But in the 1820s, missionaries start moving to Hawaii, and what they find to convert the local peoples. But what they find is this beautiful place. And if we're being realistic here, Hawaii used to not have snakes, and Hawaii did not have mosquitoes. Those are the two bad things, although there's hardly any snakes in Hawaii anymore. But can you imagine Hawaii with no snakes and no mosquitoes? So we start sending missionaries over there, and they tell tales of how amazing this place is. And so curious capitalists and plantation owners begin heading over in the 1830s. And what they find is they can grow stuff in Hawaii. There's abundant sugar cane. There is, you can grow other fruit, right? And so that will become incredibly key. And so in order to run these plantations, we begin importing labor. And this is really important, because most of the plantations in Hawaii really rely on this imported labor. And that at first will be waves of Chinese labor. Then as anti-Chinese sentiment rises in mainland United States, we'll switch to an importation of Japanese labor. Then we'll see an importation of Filipino, Portuguese, German, and Korean. And so part of what's really interesting and unique about Hawaii is this massive multiracial workforce, right? And it is all interracial, and so there's a lot of different ethnicities, different languages, which creates a very distinct culture in addition to the already existing culture that was there. Now, how do we go from just working in Hawaii to actually taking it? Well, this comes down to one major fruit company called the Dole Fruit Company. This company is still around today. Go look at the next time you buy bananas or oranges or whatever, right? They'll have a little Dole sticker. They're still very wealthy and very prominent to this day. So in 1887, we start to see a power struggle with the Dole corporations and other corporations in Hawaii fighting to wrestle power away from the monarchy. Now, this is before Hawaii is technically annexed by the United States, quote unquote. This is still considered a sovereign nation by everyone else. So we start to see this power struggle, and the Dole Corporation manages to take over a good chunk of power along with several of the other corporations, right? They kind of stage a coup. But in 1892, Queen Liuokalani, I can't pronounce her name, I'm going to butcher it, but our wonderful queen takes back power. Now, she's pretty rad. She's in the previous picture there. She's young when she takes power, and she's sort of very much trying to deal with all these people and stand up for her people and do all this stuff. But she officially takes back power. And this is when Dole, who owned a whole bunch of pineapple plantations at the time, basically goes to the United States government and asks them for help. And he says, please come intervene. Send us U.S. Marines. Help us overthrow this queen, right? Help us take this new island as part of the United States. Now, Dole wants that for several reasons. First, he believes that he will be appointed governor. Second, he believes that if Hawaii can be annexed by the United States, it will get rid of a lot of tariffs that he had to pay to import for Americans to import his goods, right? If he becomes part of America, he no longer has to pay those tariffs. But what he has to do is he has to convince the United States why they would want Hawaii. And it has to be more than just, it's pretty, right? So what Hawaii becomes and what he really sells it as, and this is, there's a lot of truth to this, it's an excellent provisioning spot for the American military. It is an excellent trading post. It is a good stop for whaling ships. We don't have any strategic position like Hawaii anywhere else in the world, and this gives us a very important spot, particularly as we're trying to sort of compete with the level of the European countries. Bandit, shush, come here. Let me just give you snuggles. Come here. It's okay. Rub up your belly. There you go. Yeah. And so also, you're selling, there's fertile crops, there's all this stuff. You can even sell, there's the quote unquote uncivilized population for American Protestant missionaries to now, go do their missionary work. And so he's basically asking the U.S. government for help. When the queen moves to establish a stronger monarchy, the Americans, under the leader of Samuel Dole, end up deposing her, right? They take her out of power. The planters then convince the United States to come in, although it does take a little while. And finally, Hawaii will be declared a protectorate several years later. Because when Grover Cleveland gets into power, he actually opposes annexation and actually tries to restore the queen. When he does that, so when Cleveland comes in, he's like, nope, we don't want to do that. Let's he was part of the anti-imperialist league. He's like, put the queen back in power. But Dole just says, fine, screw you, and declares Hawaii as an independent republic altogether. As we get into the rise of the Spanish-American War in 1898, that's when the tide of American opinions will turn. We will officially annex Hawaii in 1898 with the urging of President William McKinley, and Dole is appointed governor. Hawaii will officially become a territory, which is just a subtle distinction, in 1900, and it takes until 1959 for Hawaii to actually officially become a state, and it's linked to Alaska. So that's when it will finally enter, but we controlled it up until that point. So this is just a quick little map there, right? If you can see, find the Hawaiian Islands on there, right, from the United States. These are other islands that we eventually end up asserting elements of influence in, but the Hawaiian Islands right there gives a really good station, particularly as we're trying to trade possibly with China or with Australia or the other European empires there, but also as we want to do trade down in South America. So it's a really important strategic position for us. Oh no, it's frozen. All right. So we're just going to do a couple more slides here for the sake of time and allowing other classes to catch up. So if you finish this early, you can go ahead and work on other stuff. But I'm just going to go ahead and introduce the Spanish-American War. This should also actually read chapter 21. I know it says 20 on your lecture. All right. So the Spanish-American War is going to start with the War for Cuban independence. So at the time, Spain controlled the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. And the Cubans did not want to be controlled by Spain anymore. So in 1895, they lead a rebellion under the leadership of a Cuban patriot named Jose Marti. This revolt was really prompted by the failure of the Spanish government. They had promised to institute reforms to the Cuban people, but it didn't work. So, that wrong year. So Marti leads this big rebellion, and he actually leads it in 1868. It's called the 10 Years' War, and it lasts until 1878, naturally, when the rebellion fails. Now, another uprising will take place in 1895, and this one is really the one that we're going to be looking at. So in order to squash the rebellion, the Spanish send over a general named Valeriano Weyler, W-Y-L-E-R, and he is sent to crush the rebellion. Now, he would not be remembered as, he's known as the Butcher. He was actually a very interesting young and progressive young man back in Spain, but he decides to set up what would become concentration camps all throughout Cuba, where he would pull all of the Cuban peoples out from the countryside in an attempt to try to forbid them from protecting the revolutionaries, right? So the Cubans would be put in this really awful situation. If they were caught helping the revolutionaries, they would be killed. If they were caught helping the Spanish, they would be killed. And if they didn't do anything, they'd be thrown in these concentration camps where they would likely die. Thousands upon thousands of people will die of disease and starvation and all of this. The brutality of these camps and the Spanish actions will end up making its way to America because the yellow journalists really want to jump on this idea, right? This sounds great. This is super exciting for them to sensationalize, right? This is murder and brutality and colonialism, all the things that we hate but are excited by. And even our newspapers will exaggerate Weyler's ruthlessness, which was already incredibly ruthless. Now, in 1897, a couple of years after the rebellion has broken out, the Spanish government starts to get a little bit alarmed at how involved the United States are, just in terms of public opinion. We're not intervening, we're not doing anything like that, but the American public is very anti-Spain and very pro-Cuban. Weyler ends up being brought back to Spain, and the Spanish are sort of like, hey, rebels, like maybe we can figure something out, but the rebels are like, no, we want complete and utter independence. So we don't want to make a deal, we want to be independent. So this is going to lead the United States to conclude that, well, hey, Spain has kind of mostly lost control of Cuba. Maybe it's time for us to aid the Cubans in setting up, everything that is Cuba. So we go in and we say, these people are trying to become democratic, right? They're patriots fighting for their own freedom. Let's help them. And so the United States intervenes under the guise of helping the Cubans set up self-determination, set up their own government, and become entirely independent. Now, even with this, we're still going to need a concrete reason to fight a European country. And so what we're going to end up doing is pointing to the explosion of something called the USS Maine. So we want Spain out, right? But we also are scared of having an all-black republic that close to our border, right? Having Cuba be its own independent country. With Spain, at least we know which way it goes, right? We know what they're going to do is easier for us to predict. With Cuba being independent, that's harder. And so we get a little freaked out by this, right? We're not exactly sure what we want to do. So in April of 1898, Senator Harry M. Teller from Colorado proposes an amendment, sort of an idea of what we should do. Because the United States wanted to declare war against Spain, and Cuba's like, against Spain, and America's like, okay, well, maybe. So the Teller Amendment would amend our declaration of war. It would say, yes, we're declaring war, but. And so what it said, what the but was we would not establish permanent control over Cuba. It stated that the United States, quote, hereby disclaims any disposition of intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said island, except for pacification thereof, and it asserts determination, when that is accomplished, to leave the government and control of the island to its people. The Teller Amendment is passed through on April 19th of 1898. And true to the letter of the Teller Amendment, I mean, we abide by this. The Spanish troops leave the island in 1898, and the United States will occupy Cuba until 1902, when we determine that they have set up their government, they're good to go, and we leave. However, as we'll look at in a minute, we will leave the door wide open for re-intervention. But again, all of this, right, is evidence of this fact that this is perfect for what we're trying to get at, right? We can be both involved and not involved at the same time, right? We can be there to help. Hi, Bandit. But we don't have to be Europe, right? We don't have to be conquerors this way. That's great for us. So the final thing we're going to talk about is how we actually get into the war. And this is with the explosion of the USS Maine. So during the rebellion in Cuba, the United States sent the USS Maine, which is a ship, to Cuba in January of 1898 to help protect and evacuate any Americans if danger occurred or protect American interests. Now, 3 weeks later, at 9:40 in the evening of February 15th, there was an explosion on board the USS Maine. Now, later investigations will reveal that more than 5 tons of powder charges for the vessel's guns ignited, essentially obliterating the forward third of the ship. The wreckage then sinks to the bottom of the harbor, and 260 men lose their lives as a result of the explosion. 8 more will die later from injuries. Several of the officers survived just because they were closest to the captain's quarters, managed to survive. And so they investigate. And what they determine is that the USS Maine had been exploded by a naval mine, which essentially means another country blew up our ship. And we determine that country to be Spain. Now, the bigger question, though, is what actually blew up the Maine? If it was ammunition on board that caused the explosion, what caused the ammunition to explode? Was it actually a mine, or was it simply a boiler room explosion? Now, years later, we will reinvestigate this, and we kind of determine it was probably a boiler room explosion. There's a very similar ship that exploded, the same model of the USS Maine that exploded while sailing down the coast of California for no reason. So we think that now that's likely. However, the explosion of the Maine and the determination that it was possibly done by a foreign nation is all the media needs to get us involved. Right? They are going to go crazy. We have 268 American men killed in a mysterious explosion off the coast of a country, who's fighting for justice, and probably done by a country who is a colonial and imperialist nation that terrifies us. So overnight, we have the military and the American tide turn against the Spanish government, and cries of remember the Maine will become an overnight battle cry. And Americans will get super excited about this. Now, the people who will help with none of this are William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, right? Both of them will, in their dueling newspapers, in an attempt to get support for this, right, they'll use yellow journalism to incite public support and demand for a war. They blame Spain for the explosion of the Maine. They talk about you know, right, destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. They point to the evils of the Spanish Empire and blame everything on them. And so with this, we are able to enter at the very end of the war on the side of the Cubans. All right, we will go ahead and finish this up when I see you guys next week. Thanks for doing all of this. I will see you guys later. Uh-oh, this is going to take a second. Hi, Bandit. I love you.